Welcome to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here in Nottingham. And with me I have Dr. Francis Knight, who's an expert in the history of modern Christianity. One very interesting period in the history of Christianity is what was happening in Christianity, particularly in Britain. At that time, the very last years of the reign of Queen Victoria and the first years of the reign of King Edward VII, when people had a sense that an age was coming to an end, and they gave it the French title, the Fin de Siècle. Francis, why study the religion of the Fin de Siècle?
Well, you're asking me this at a very good time, because I have just written a book on this subject, Victorian Christianity at the Fin de Siècle. And I feel I should explain why I did it. I mean, the Fin de Siècle is a concept that's often not familiar to people in this country. It's obviously a French term. It means the end of the century. It's typically applied to the end of the 19th century, although people have sometimes attempted to apply it to other centuries. But it is generally associated, I suppose, with other European cities, Paris, Vienna, Berlin. But there was an English Fin de Siècle, in fact, that tended to be focused on London, and as well as being a kind of historical episode, as you say, the end of the 19th century. Personally, I tend to think of it as actually coming to a cut-off in 1901. I mean, we can have a discussion about when it should be. My definition is 1885 to 1901.
Oh, well, that's very precise.
Yes, so it's not the Edwardian period,
Okay.
although some other historians would see it as going on until the...
Well, we won't discuss that,
no.
because historians, all periods when used by historians are little sort of shelves to just rest things on. So we'll just work with.
So that's the kind of answer about the chronology of it. But it's also, of course, an idea. It's a metaphor. It's an idea of exhaustion. It's slightly odd to think of time operating so that when we get to the end of a century, we're kind of morally exhausted. But actually, if you think about the parallel with the end of the year, when we get to the end of December, we talk about this being the end of the year, the new year coming, a fresh year. So there are lots of sort of metaphors around endings and beginnings, which were really quite strongly applied to the 19th century. But in terms of how it's been used by other scholars, the thing that struck me and what really got me going on wanting to do this book was that it's a very significant concept for literary critics, for people in cultural history, for people in social history.
People in art history as well.
In art history, indeed, yes. But religious history, my own field, it had been almost completely neglected. So what I really wanted to do in this book was to bring religious history, British religious history, which of course this period really means Christianity, into dialogue with some of the ideas and people who shaped the English Fin de Siècle. So that was the reason for wanting to take the project on. And
well, this is the proverbial question of historians. When you make a period, you make somehow a statement that the period is different to something earlier and different to what comes later. So how is Christianity in Britain different in the Fin de Siècle? Is it different to what was earlier?
It's not just in Christianity, but in
British
culture, British culture generally.
Okay.
It's the end of Victorianism and the beginning of modernism. So it is this period of clash, really, because although Victoria was obviously technically still alive until 1901,
she was actually still alive as well.
She was. Yeah. Okay. So the Victorian age technically lasted until 1901. That's the point. A lot of the ideas that had been associated with the mid-Victorian world had gone, and there was a sense of newness. So the concept of Janiformity obviously deriving from the notion of Janus, who looks both forwards and backwards, associated with the month of January. That's a key idea at this period. And it's a bit like, if we want to parallel it with another period, I would say it is as significant as the 1960s, which is the other decade in modern history that's had tremendous change and ramifications.
So are you seeing the Fin de Siècle as a sort of a cultural and therefore with a religious dimension melting pot?
Yes, it's a hinge between the two different worlds of Victorianism and modernism, if we can call it that.
Can you give me an example of how that actually played out? In the sense that, for instance, something that wouldn't have happened in, say, 1875 happened, and that did happen in the late 1880s, 1890s.
I think we could perhaps look at the whole phenomenon of conversion. We get a whole lot of figures who are associated with the aesthetic movement, which is obviously one of the things which emerges from the Fin de Siècle, and particularly with the decadent strand within aestheticism, becoming interested in conversion to Roman Catholicism specifically, in a way that they hadn't exactly earlier. So that's a particular moment from the 1890s, I suppose.
Right. The other thing is there any sense in how religious people perceive themselves change in that? Like, I'm thinking in terms of we associate the 19th century with great movements such as Darwin. How do and so we know there's the religious reaction to Darwin. Is there any sense in which the Fin de Siècle there's a different self-perception of?
Yeah, I mean, I would be hesitant to make too much of the religious reaction to Darwin.
Okay.
I think, I mean, one of the myths that we've been trying to bust over recent decades is that, suddenly agnosticism took hold the moment that Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. I think what we see in the Fin de Siècle period is Christianity being something that becomes able to be expanded and remoulded and remade in some ways which were directly fashioned by the aesthetic movement, actually, and also a very strong interest in social questions as well, which is a feature of the period too.
Well, let's talk about the aesthetic movement. So, for instance, would you see something like Percy Dermer's work, his work on Anglican liturgy? Is that a Fin de Siècle phenomenon?
Well, it is. I would see him very much as a Fin de Siècle figure, actually, because he is working on what becomes his great work, the Parson's Handbook. But he's also he's involved with the whole variety of Christian social movements, actually. That's how he's earning his living in the 1890s. He's working with Stuart Headland on the Christian Social Guild and with various others.
So there's actually a link up between the aesthetic movement in religion and the social questions issue.
Oh, very much. Yeah, very much. And also his wife, Mabel, is involved in, she's an artist, and she is involved in illustrating and providing material for the Yellow Book, which is the classic Fin de Siècle publication, really, this series of journals which are produced during the course of the 1890s. In other words, there's a complex web of interrelationships between the religious culture and the artistic culture. Yeah, exactly. It's a complex web of people who knew each other, were influenced by each other, and interacted with each other in a whole variety of different ways. So it's a great mixture of people and some really quite surprising connections, I think.
And if you want to follow it up more, read your book.
Read the book, which I'm hoping may go into paperback in the not too distant future.
Oh, well, always a thing we hope for.
Yeah.
Frances, thank you very much.
Thank you.